asking what is going on.
I want to bring in my panel this afternoon, Liberal MP Tim Wilson and the Shadow Cabinet Secretary on the Labor side of politics, Jenny McAllister. Hello and welcome to both of you.
Hi, PK.
Thank you for having us.
I just want to talk briefly about this casuals ruling because it's quite significant. On that federal court ruling regarding casual entitlements, firstly to you, Jenny McAllister, what do you make of that decision?
Well, this is a really important decision. It essentially says that if you are working in a regular way, if you've made a forward commitment about the hours that you're going to commit to this employer, then your employer needs to treat you as a person who is employed on a permanent basis. And that means if you're providing that employer with security, you're guaranteeing that you're going to be available to them, they need to provide you with some security as well. And that means leave entitlements, annual leave, sick leave, all of the ordinary things that make for a good, secure job. It's a really important decision.
And of course, the government won't rule anything in or out, but Tim Wilson, it is possible that legislation will be on the cards. The minister warning that this is bad for business. What's your view? You're a Liberal backbencher. Would you like to see legislation to try and stop this?
Well, I think the government's taken the appropriate response, which is actually to say that they're leaving options on the table. They're waiting in part to see how the parties involved in this dispute seek to appeal it or not. But I think we need to get to the point of what's actually happening is people are getting higher loading associated with their employment to cover things like annual leave because as a casual, they're not entitled to it. What the court has then recognised is that they continue to get those benefits and that loading, but they also get a separate benefit as well. So you're getting a double up, and that's where there's an issue for business because it effectively makes some people more expensive to employ and could have a very real impact on jobs.
OK, so are you arguing that business can't afford this right now? Is that your argument, Tim Wilson?
Well, I think a lot of businesses are struggling all over Australia. And of course, a lot of businesses that are already struggling don't need more costs and more burdens. But I think the decision has to be considered very carefully. I think Christian Porter, the Attorney General, has got his approach right, both to see what the parties do and then in the court decision and whether it's going to be appealed to the High Court, and to then make an assessment about what response may come from that. Because the idea you can have some employees entitled to benefits in place of taking certain types of leave or annual leave, and then also getting annual leave isn't just costly, it's actually unfair to other workers who aren't entitled to the same benefits.
So, Jenny McAllister, I mean, I know you've made the case for why you think this judgment is important and a good judgment, but how about that argument that this is not a good time for business in the wake of COVID-19?
Well, I think Tim's fundamentally misstating what's at stake here. This employer chose to improperly employ this person as a casual, when in fact they were a permanent. And surely the government does not believe that that is widespread. If that's widespread across the industry, if that's widespread amongst employers, we have a very serious problem. This employer was not following the law in terms of how this employee was supposed to be categorised. They were entitled to permanent benefits, and instead their employment had been deliberately structured to deprive them of those benefits. And that's wrong, and it's not fair.
All right, let's park that issue and talk about one of the biggest stories of our time, and that's the relationship with China. In fact, I spoke with the Shadow Agriculture Minister, Joel Fitzgibbon. He was on this program a little earlier, and he told me an inquiry into COVID-19 was inevitable, and I think directly said, so Australia didn't need to be out in front there offending the Chinese. I'll start with you, Tim Wilson. What's your response to that? Was an inquiry ultimately inevitable, that Australia took a risk by playing it so publicly rather than quietly and diplomatically?
Well, I don't understand how you can argue it was inevitable when the Chinese, for starters, were resisting a push for an independent inquiry. Then for Joel Fitzgibbon to say something offended the Chinese, I think the basis should be then, what is it that's been offensive to the Chinese? He hasn't answered that question. Why is it that something has been said, and what is it that's being said that's offensive? And then also, ultimately, is that now the position of the Labor Party that our Prime Minister, for calling for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19, is now offensive to the Chinese? We know at the start of, and if that's what he is arguing, then that's a pretty radical departure, I think, from the position that a lot of his shadow ministers have been taken. But I've got to say, I have deep scepticism about the motivations of Joel Fitzgibbon. This is a man who previously took undisclosed trips to China from Chinese interests. At the time, Kevin Rudd, frankly, should have sacked him for that conduct. And for now him to come and start asserting that our Prime Minister has offended the Chinese government without any basis or any evidence or even outlining what the problem is and saying investigation was inevitable is farcical.
Jenny McAllister, it is actually a different line than other Labor front benches. Do you agree with Joel Fitzgibbon that Australia didn't need to be out there in front offending the Chinese?
Look, we've said from the beginning that we would have done this a little bit differently. We said it would have been better if there was diplomatic support lined up before we announced our intention to pursue this. And we've also said that the emphasis ought to have been on understanding, not on blame. And that actually it was in China's interest and in the world's interest that we get to the bottom of the origin of the virus and how it was handled. I think that's pretty straightforward. I think that Joel, quite understandably, is a passionate advocate for the sectors that he represents as a shadow minister. He's very close to the producers in the agricultural sector, and a lot of them are hurting right now. But Labor's very clear about this. We think that it is a good outcome that was obtained to have an investigation initiated.
Sure, but I wanted you to respond to this. Sorry, I'm going to be sneaky and get back in here because I've asked you directly on the language. He says, so Australia didn't need to be out there in front offending the Chinese.
I think our view is that we ought to have obtained diplomatic support before we began.
Is that because we didn't want to offend the Chinese?
That's incidentally the approach suggested by Julie Bishop to a long-standing coalition.
But is it about trying not to offend the Chinese? That's my question.
I think it's about being effective. My view is that we ought to seek outcomes in our international...
But Australia got the outcome, didn't it? On that basis, there was an outcome.
It's a good outcome, and we welcome the establishment of an inquiry. It's not the outcome that the government originally said they were seeking, which was an investigation independent of the World Health Organization. But it's a good and important outcome. It was signed on to, I think, 137 countries. That is a good outcome, and we welcome it.
Tim Wilson, in the past week, China has banned some Australian beef exporters and slapped this 80% tariff on Australian barley. And now there's speculation that Beijing is perhaps drawing up a hit list of Australian imports, including maybe wine and dairy. Are you worried that Beijing is targeting Australia?
Well, I think what the approach that Australia is taking in this entire discussion is to stand up for our national interest. Now, there will be countries that will respond and consider how we're doing so. That's why the Prime Minister, despite what Jenny says, the Prime Minister's approach has been very considered, which is to take a clear public position on issues like the independent investigation and then to rally other countries to support the cause that we are pushing, because it's in our national interest, it's in the global community's interest, and it's utterly defendable based on what we should want to achieve as a nation. In fact, it's been a huge success in terms of the middle power diplomacy that Australia has been able to project to the world. Now, of course, China can be responsible for its own conduct, but none of us would like to see a scenario where we trade less with our products. We want to continue to export them to China and to be able to see the benefits from mutual cooperation with them. But ultimately, that's a decision for them. And of course, justifiably, when they overstep the line, we take these matters to the World Trade Organization and seek independent investigation.
Let's talk about borders, internal borders. Big question, really. First to you, Jenny McAllister. Are borders, internal borders, now our new schools debate? I feel like now even Victoria's going back. I still have 2 weeks left for anyone who cares. You know, we were having this big debate and it was an argument between the federal government and the states. Now that seems to be settled. School will begin. But internal borders are a huge issue. Do you believe that some of these states, Queensland for instance, should open their borders?
Well, I think it goes to the tenor of the national debate, doesn't it? Scott Morrison was very pleased to work with the state governments at the outset of this. I think it would be a shame if the Federal Liberal Party, the Federal Coalition, wanted to return to business as usual, slanging matches with Labor premiers. It is quite sensible for Labor states to make their own judgments about what's in the interests of their state and their population. And they are doing that on the basis of the health advice that's provided to them. I think it would be better if the Commonwealth turned their mind to the issues that are confronting the economy overall. We have very serious numbers present on the table this week in relation to job losses, to unemployment. There is no sign that the economy is going to snap back in September. We're yet to hear a plan from the federal government about their plan for the economy at the end of September. I think it would be better if those frontbenchers in the Liberal government turned their mind to those questions rather than picking fights with state premiers.
Tim Wilson, is this another sort of example of picking fights with state premiers? Because the government federally, the Attorney-General, for instance, now Peter Dutton, have been putting a lot of pressure on the states, particularly Queensland, to reopen those borders.
Well, everything Jenny just said was farcical. We started this interview talking about how we had Labor shadow ministers attacking the federal government. What our focus has been is on making sure we work with the states successfully to reopen the economy in a staged and managed way based on evidence. Now, all Peter Dutton has done is turned around and asked basic questions of the state government about its rationale and the evidence base that there is a benefit to continuing to close the borders to other states for Queensland, because we know that particularly in the middle of the year, in the later part of the year in September, during the school holiday period, Queensland and tourism operators and the Queensland economy, the point that Jenny just raised that we should be focused on, are heavily dependent on interstate migration, particularly Victorians trying to escape the bad weather outside and looking for warmer temperatures. They say it's beautiful one day, perfect the next. Victorians are looking forward to that in Queensland. But you can't do it if you close your borders. So there's nothing wrong with asking legitimate questions and for the state to explain the rationale and the evidence base that sits behind them.
Is this part of the issue, though, Tim Wilson? And then I'd love to hear from you too, Jenny McAllister, that we've got this disconnect between the local advice that's been provided by the scientists, by the health officer in Queensland, and then federally. And of course, well, the state says they're choosing their own health advice. Well, things just went dark in Melbourne, let me tell you. It is bad weather outside. I don't think it was that bad, though. Lost Tim Wilson there, so I'll ask